So my name is Gavin Smith. I am the TMT sector and practice head at Allens. I wear a couple of hats, so that is my principal role, but my other role is that I founded and am the head of the Allens Accelerate practice for startups and high growth companies at the firm. I also sit on the firm's innovation working group as well at Allens, so that is my role. So I think the focus today of your inquiry was to learn a bit more about our Allens Accelerate practice and what it is. To kick off, when was it founded and why did we do that? Really the genesis of Allens Accelerate was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. We recognised at that time that there were more capital inflows coming into Australia, into startups and high growth companies from overseas venture capital firms. So there was just a greater amount of investment from particularly US and UK based VC firms. And so we saw a greater energy in the startup community in Australia than we had seen before. Coupled with that, we also saw some quite interesting developments in a couple of specific sectors in the startup emerging company sectors, particularly around fintech and a couple of other sectors like agri-tech and so on. And so we felt that there was an energy and an inflow of capital that warranted us as a firm looking at that sector and doing something in it. The question though was, for us, how does a big firm like Allens go and do something in that sector when we traditionally are a firm that services the big end of town, major corporates, and startups, of course, don't have much money, and what little money they do have, they don't want to necessarily spend on legal services. They want to spend on building their product and getting out to market. So we asked ourselves that question and decided to launch a practice that provides low cost and in some cases free services to startups and high growth companies. Really with a couple of strategic aims in mind. So the first was to build a portfolio of what we call clients of the future. So if you accept the mantra that the ASX 200 will be 50% different in 5 or 10 years' time. That's not to say that those companies that are currently in the ASX 200 will have disappeared, but that the composition of the ASX 200 will have changed in that sort of degree of turnover. Then you ask yourself, where do those companies come from? And in some cases, at least, those companies will have come from relatively early stage companies at this time. And so really the strategy is about beginning a relationship at a very early stage with what we hope will become clients of the future. And we acknowledge that with startups and high growth companies there are high levels of failure. Venture capital firms tend to say that they have a hit rate of say 1 in 15 or 1 in 20. So we acknowledge that there are high rates of failure, but that's okay. So our philosophy is that we will begin a relationship with a reasonably large number, and some will be successful, and perhaps some will become the next Atlassian or the next freelancer or a very large company. So that was really the genesis of the practice. How does it work? So we have two sides to the practice. So one is the practice focused on advising startups and emerging companies themselves. The other is advising investors into that sector. So for startups themselves, the initial point of contact for us is that we made a suite of 15 core legal documents available on a fully open access, open source basis to the startup community. So very simple access. All that happens is that a startup comes onto our website, they sign up, they fill in a few details on an online form, and that then allows them then to download those documents. And we deliberately made those documents fully customizable for the startups. So they have guidance notes throughout with optionality throughout. And so the hope was that a reasonably large degree, startups could use those documents themselves without having to incur significant cost in using lawyers. So that's the base level interaction. Then what we then call our sort of level one paying services are a set of very basic services for early stage startups, so incorporation services, basic IP protection packages, and so on. And those are all fixed cost packages. And we also sell fixed blocks of time at a very low cost, so well below our standard charge out rates, to customize the documents, so the A suite documents. So that's our level one services. And then what we call our level two services are when a startup or a high growth company goes to the next level and they need to do something more complex. So that might be a capital raising. It might be that they need regulatory advice. So in the fintech sector, for example, they very well may need financial services regulatory advice. And so we'll deliver that work to them in a really cost-conscious manner. So that generally means fixed prices. And most of our startups opt for the fixed price option because it gives them budget certainty. The other alternative that we do sometimes is we do a very, very deep discount on our standard hourly rates. And in recognition of that, the startup acknowledges that they're starting a long-term relationship with us, that they're about to go hopefully on a journey with us, and that our fees will normalise over time as they go through their funding and cash flow cycle. So as they get larger, they will sort of migrate over time towards being more of a traditional sized client of the firm, and so will our fees. Interestingly, we find that the vast majority of startups just prefer budget certainty, so they just want fixed price, and that makes things easy for them. So that means we need to be quite careful about the way we do it. We don't make much, if any, money out of our initial engagements with these companies, and we do that deliberately because it is genuinely an investment into a long-term relationship. In terms of how we team that, so we quite deliberately don't have a dedicated practice, so a standalone group of lawyers who only do this work. We do that for a couple of reasons. The first is that we find that working with companies of this type, particularly in the technology space, we learn a huge amount from them. So you're very close to a lot of very cutting-edge technology, stuff that is pushing the boundaries. And our lawyers can learn a huge amount from working with those companies that we can then take into our broader practice in working with our larger, more traditional clients. If we quarantine a group of lawyers somewhere on our bottom floors doing this type of work only, we would potentially lose that knowledge transfer benefit that we get. The other reason we don't have a dedicated team and we spread it out across our broader practice areas is that we see this as being a sort of an adjunct, an additional part of someone's practice. So take a corporate M&A lawyer, for example. They may one day be doing a very large M&A transaction for a big client, and at the same time they may also be running a venture capital investment into the startup industry or running a capital raise for a startup client. And we want them to be able to jump between those two different types of work. In terms of the response and how it has gone, I say this cautiously, but it's been really, really terrific. So we've had somewhere along the lines of about 3,000 unique downloads of the A Suite, the free open source A Suite documents. So that's 3,000 separate companies downloading those documents. And we hear that those documents now sort of do the rounds and circulate amongst the community and somewhat wider as well than that. In terms of our client base, we now have somewhere between 60 and 70 startups, emerging companies on our books at varying stages of of maturity. So some are very early stage, some are slightly later stage, so Series B, Series C funding rounds. We recently advised on the IPO of Redbubble, and that was a company which was really almost a template for this model, where we had started work for them as a very small company and taken them all the way through to IPO, and they are now listed with a very significant market valuation on the ASX.
I ask you about the recruitment of staff to work in this area. Are there any specific qualifications you look for? Are you looking for lawyers who have programming skills, IT skills in particular, or is the recruitment wider than that?
It's wider than that. Not all of these clients are technology clients, but most are in some way technology enabled. That is true. So the way we recruit people to come and work on these matters is we really just ask for people to nominate themselves, and it's a question of enthusiasm and passion, and a passion for the sector, and an interest and a knowledge of technology is important, but not necessary. But most important of all, it's just we want our lawyers to feel passionate about helping this part of the economy, and that means that they click with the companies they're advising. So it is as simple as that.
And just on that, what role do young lawyers have in doing that work?
Really high role. So that has been one of the terrific things about the program. So they get very high touch with the clients, a greater degree of autonomy than they might perhaps with some of our highest level largest clients. And on the business development front as well, they get a lot of exposure. So it's very hard for any major firm to send our very young lawyers out and say, generate a new piece of work from one of the big four banks, because that's very hard to get them to do that at a young age. But what we can do is send them out into the startup community or venture capital community and say, use your contacts with your compatriots, people who you went to university with, and bring some work in. And they love that chance to go and develop business, and it really gives them a chance to hone their business development skills at an early age.
I understand that you've been looking at blockchain as part of this work. In terms that a lawyer can understand, can you explain what blockchain is? And how it would fit within legal services work?
Yes, that's a $64 million question. So
I've asked that question a few times,
yes.
But I'm still asking it.
Yes. Okay. In very, very simple terms, blockchain, or I prefer to use the term distributed ledger technology, is a very large, encrypted, secure, distributed database to which every entity which is a part of that has exactly the same access to the same information, with the same information being replicated across all the nodes or the participation points in that database, automatically replicated and checked and corroborated when changes are made at any one point within that database. The cryptography is an important feature of this, because it means that you have effectively a combined source of single source of truth, but that single source of truth is distributed across all elements of the database. These distributed ledgers can allow for information to be exchanged or other things to be exchanged, and the most common thing that people think about here is cryptocurrency, but it can be used in fact for many different things. How does it affect the legal industry? I think the thing that most people think about is smart contracts, and what do smart contracts mean for lawyers? A lot of things that are called smart contracts are in fact not contracts, not legal contracts in the sense of true contracts in a legal sense. They're actually just a series of coded instructions for the execution of particular things to happen on the occurrence of particular conditionalities or particular events occurring. In the future, those things could perhaps become fully fledged, fully formed contracts. And I think that's what's most interesting for the legal industry, is how do we as lawyers begin to develop smart contracts with clients or for clients. What is our involvement going to be, and what happens if some of those things go wrong? What is the dispute resolution process, and so on. So that just is sort of touching on the top of the iceberg, I think.